Right, I'd like to welcome everybody here this evening, wherever you are in the country. Welcome to tonight's teleconference on worm control and specifically nematodirus. Tonight we have Lesley Stubbings talking about worm control. Lesley heads up the SCOPS group and is, the most expert person I know to talk about the topic. So we have the best person to give us the latest advice for this year, and nematodirus is always a moving feat, and we have new technology that will help us hopefully determine what's happening this year on the ground. So I think if anyone's got any questions as we go through this evening, the email to email them into so that I can ask them over to Lesley is brpconf@ahdb.org.uk. So that's brpconf@ahdb.org.uk. So if you've got any questions, or if you wanted to text in any questions, you can use the number 07775 884 851. I'll say that again in case you haven't got a chance to jot that down. It's 07775 884 851. And that's for any questions you want to ask over to Lesley. We might bring questions in as we go through. It just depends how questions come in and what and how we get on. But I think if we start, Lesley, with going through the first bits of the worm control, and depending how questions come in, I might interrupt and ask some questions as we go through, if that's okay with you.
Yeah, of course it is. That's fine. Yeah, if they come in and we've got a bit of a running order, Katie, so if they come in and they're relevant to where we are, then let's take them at that point, I think.
Yep, that's fine with me.
Okay, so the only other thing to say to everybody is if you do happen to be sitting comfortably, which I guess some people aren't because you're probably coming from the lambing shed or whatever, but if you do have a copy of Manual 8 handy, I'll refer as we go through. If you haven't got it handy and you want to pick one up later on, then just make a note of the page numbers and you can spend a bit more time on those later. Okay?
Yep, no, that's fine. And if anybody hasn't actually got Manual 8, it was emailed across with the reminder earlier on today, the link to it. Or if you need that, then email in on the conference, and then I can email you a copy across.
Okay, all right. So as Katie said, the main topic for tonight, but we will wander off down into some more general worm control topics, is to look at nematodirus. Quite a few of you will have seen that it's been in the print and out of the press quite a few weeks already this season. And, you know, you will also appreciate, I think, no matter whereabouts you are in the country, we've had some pretty up and down, tempted to say abnormal, I'm not sure what's normal anymore, weather patterns both this winter and spring. So actually, it's making it very difficult for people just to sit back and use perhaps what you'd normally use to be able to predict your nematodirus risk. And what I will do now, and I'll do it later on as well, is encourage you all to go and have a look at the forecast that we've got on the SCOPS website this year, because what that does is move us on a long way from where we've been previously, in that we've linked the model that's been produced by Bristol University, which looks at temperatures, which is very much a determinant of when we expect there to be a hatch in nematodirus. And it's linked them in real time on a day-by-day basis. It's updated to 140 weather stations throughout the UK. So when you go on that now, you click on the nematodirus forecast map, what you will see are the equivalent, if you zoom it in, there's the equivalent of 140 weather stations. So you can choose the one which is most applicable to you, and have a look at what that's predicting in terms of your temperatures. Now, at the moment, the majority of the country is sitting on yellow, which is a low risk. But we have had 3 confirmed cases already, and really what that means is that you've just got to start interpreting it a little bit more carefully, because those 3 cases have all been on south-facing slopes where they have had some warm weather. A minute, but just to really make the point at this stage, I think that the unpredictability of the weather, Katie and I were just talking about this before we effectively came on air. We had a relatively warm weather. Certainly where I am now, we've had some very cold weather, probably had more frosts in the last fortnight than we've had all winter. And once we get into April, towards the end of April, then it can warm up very quickly, almost overnight. And it's those are the circumstances where we need to be very careful. Because nematodirus, if we just look at it, if you're looking at the manual, if you go to pages 4 and 5 in there, which talks about life cycles and knowing the enemy, the big thing about nematodirus is that it is a lamb-to-lamb infection. So the nematodirus that your lambs are likely to face as infected larvae this spring, most of those will have been dropped last spring by your previous lamb crop. Now, there is a little bit of complication in there. There is some autumn things go on with nematodirus, but essentially what you're looking at is eggs that were dropped last spring, sitting on the pasture, waiting around. They go through a system whereby they become almost fertilised, and then they come back to life, if you like, and hatch out when the temperatures are right the following spring. Now, if we get a spring where it's really quite a nice, long, protracted spring, it gets warm gradually, then what we find is that we get a gradual hatching of these eggs. But if we have a cold spell and it stays cold and then suddenly warms up, then we get what we call this mass hatch that you hear us all talking about. And it's the mass hatch that causes serious disease. So this is why looking at temperatures and looking at a risk assessment is so important when you're trying to decide whether or not you need to treat for nematodirus, and indeed when to treat for nematodirus. So if you go onto the SCOPS website, one of the things that you will find on there, if you click on the nematodirus forecast, and then alongside that map you'll see another download and then a risk assessment. I think the risk assessment is something that I would encourage you to do, and probably do for each main group of your lambs, because it will determine and just guide you in the right area as to whether or not you need to be concerned about them. So the first question that's on there is the obvious one: are your lambs grazing pasture that carried lambs last spring? If they're grazing new lay, they're grazing an area that didn't have lambs on last spring, then immediately they're going to be at a low risk. It then goes on and asks you, are they old enough? Now, nematodirus in lambs will normally hit them about 6 to 12 weeks. And of course, that is going to be concurrent with the fact that at that stage, they're going to start grazing probably around about 4 weeks. But 6 to 12 weeks, they're going to be grazing really quite hard. And if there are a lot of infected larvae on the pasture, then that's when they're going to pick them up. So for many people at the moment, your lambs are going to need to be, it's for the sort of mid-February or earlier lambs that are going to be most at risk. By the time we get to the end of April, beginning of May, then we are now then starting to look at March-born lambs and so on. So age of lamb important. Do you have groups that are likely to be at a challenge from coccidiosis? Is another question that you'll see on there, because we also know that if the two things come at the same time, a relatively low nematodirus challenge coupled with a cocci challenge will actually cause quite serious trouble, whereas each of them on their own probably wouldn't do. So again, coccidiosis is a major complicating factor. Has there been a sudden cold snap followed by a period of warm weather? At the moment, there's every risk that some people who've got lambs at risk are going to find that they are going to have this cold snap and into warm weather. And the final one on that is, have your lambs got other stresses? So you're looking for the main stresses are going to be, are they triplets? Are they frosted on lambs? Are they lambs that are on perhaps shearling to ewe lambs, or even older ewes that aren't in quite such good body condition? So all of those things, is a little table on there that you can go to and just actually do a bit of a risk assessment for yourself. And as I say, I would suggest that you perhaps print it off a few times and do it for your main groups, because not every group of lambs is going to be at the same age or at the same level of risk at any one time. Now, the good news about nematodirus is that lambs that meet it gradually when they first start to graze, if they meet a relatively low challenge, they become and develop immunity to Matadirus really quite quickly. And by the time they're 5 or 6 weeks of age, if they've met it, they've picked it up, then they will be immune. So again, think about where they've come from and whether they've been able to have a relatively low challenge. The difficult bit about nematodirus is that we'll talk about fecal egg counts and so on later on, is that the problem with it is, as a disease, normally with the other worm species, we would expect to be able to pick up quite a high egg count from the adult worms in the animal before we start to see clinical disease. Not always, but most of the time with chilidasagia, what we used to call orthotagia. But with nematodirus, the damage is done by the immature larvae. So by the time we get eggs in the feces, we're in trouble. And you can already have a lot of dead lambs by the time you start seeing nematodirus eggs in feces. So this is why the forecast is so important, and that, I would say to you, really urge you to get the SCOPS website in your favourites, and as I say, day by day it'll be updated. The colour of the dots will change, and if you keep carrying out your little risk assessment, it should really guide you to when you need to be considering treatment for those lambs. So I don't know whether there's any more questions on that particular bit. Katie, if you've had anything now, if people want to send them in, we can come back to that.
Someone has asked, so could they use a persistent drench on the lambs to protect them?
No, they can't, and that was my point number 2 on that, and I will come to that. The persistent drench, obviously we only have one chemical group, moxidectin, that is persistent, and it has no persistence against nematodirus. And so I'll come back to that just in a minute as well. Very important point that catches a lot of people out. So just before I do that, Katie, what I was just going to say to people is that, for nematodirus, we still do recommend a white drench, so group 1 benzimidazole as the preferred option for nematodirus. Now, there are a couple of reasons for that. One is it's very effective against nematodirus. Some people may have read that there have been a couple of cases of resistance in nematodirus to a white drench reported, but it still is only 2, possibly 3 cases, and no one understands why, but geographically they're all in one very small area. So a white drench is, for the majority of everybody else, still effective, but what I would urge you to do is that if you use it, then do go back in, and for nematodirus it's about 8 or 9 days after you've treated them, and just have a look at the fecal egg count just to make sure. And do that as a matter of routine. I certainly urge all my clients to do that, and for the last 3 or 4 years I've had loads of results back from my guys, and they've all come back clear. But it's having that reassurance that it is still clear. The other thing about doing that is, of course, if you use a white drench for nematodirus, you are avoiding selection pressure for resistance at other times of year when you need to use the other groups. So a lot of the sustainability of use of anthelmintics is about trying to target the worm with the right thing, so that you're not actually overusing the other groups when we need them, and that really is quite important. There's one caveat to that, and for those of you who are relatively early lambers, you don't need to worry about it, but particularly for you guys in the hills and uplands, or perhaps late April, May lambing, where your challenge for nematodirus, your 6-week-old lamb, is going to come much later. You do need to be careful that if it comes quite late in the season and there are other worms around that have already had chance, the chilidosasias, and for example, have already had time to get going, if you've got white drench resistance, then you should really have a word with your vet advisor and just decide whether it really is the right thing, because you don't want to end up treating for nematodirus and then having to go back in 2 weeks later because you failed to control the other worms. So you just need to think about that and maybe get some advice. But for most people, a white drench. Okay, so Kate, anything else on that one, Katie?
No, there's no more questions at the moment.
Okay, all right then, that's fine. So just to finish, I'll come onto the moxidectin and persistence thing again in a minute. But just to sort of leave everybody under no illusion that this year is going to be a real up and down, and it's impossible for you to be looking at really wide areas. You've really got to look at your own farm and possibly look at bits of your own farm slightly differently as well. So if you're north-facing slopes, the challenge is going to come later. South-facing slopes, it's going to come much earlier. You also find on the website, if you click on there, as cases are reported and confirmed, we're also putting little purple blobs on a second map to give you an idea where they are and just give you an extra little bit of information. So, okay, the moxidectin question. Obviously, a lot of people have been using moxidectin in their use at lambing time, and I'll say one or two things about that in a minute. But the one thing that you've got to be really, really aware of is that there is no persistence against nematodirus. So in using that product, either on your ewes and or on your lambs, you are not doing anything to prevent nematodirus at all, and that's really, really important. And in a year when nematodirus could really just catch us out, you need to be very, very careful with that one. So the persistence that moxidectin has is against tuberosauria, osteotargia, and to some extent against Haemonchus, but you do have to be careful that it's not persistent against nematodirus, and it doesn't have the persistence against the black scaleworm Trichostrongylus either. So in terms of treating ewes, I've been having some quite interesting discussions with various people in the last few weeks. Now, in terms of treating ewes at lambing time, it used to be the consensus that we would treat them all because what we wanted to do was to prevent them contaminating pastures for the lambs. And for many years that's what we did, and unfortunately the downside of that is that it's extremely selective for resistance, because treating adult animals is always going to be more selective for anthelmintic resistance. So then we tried to sort of take our foot off the gas a little bit on that and try to encourage people not to treat all of their ewes at lambing time, but to leave 10 or 20% of the fittest, healthiest ewes untreated. Now, there are two rationales behind that. One is we want to leave a few ewes untreated because we don't want to expose all of the worms to the anthelmintic, so we're not quite selective. And the other rationale behind it is that we know that if ewes are fit and healthy and they're well fed, in actual fact, that what we call the periparturient rise doesn't happen to anything like the extent that it does if they use under massive pressure in poor body condition. So we know that we can say leave your fit healthy ewes in good condition untreated, and it's not going to cause a huge problem with contamination. And indeed, over the last couple of years, I've certainly done quite a lot of monitoring in flocks of how this rise happens and where the ewes are fed well, particularly well from a protein point of view. Their immune system doesn't wane anything like we were led to believe years ago, and a lot of my guys now, treatment is the exception rather than the rule. So we're actually now in those flocks moving towards treating a small proportion of the flock and leaving the larger proportion of the flock untreated. So now I'm not suggesting that for those of you who are still worming all your ewes, you suddenly go away and throw it all in the bin. I think this is something that you have to work your way into gradually. But I do think we need to be looking towards just taking our foot off this one now for the sake of being able to keep the anthelmintics going in the future. Moxidectin has fitted into that. A lot of people have gone to using moxidectin because they know, and it's true, it will keep a persistent effect against Teleconference for a period of time. But it isn't against the other worms. And unfortunately, we're now seeing the downside of widespread use of it in terms of much more resistance now being picked up many of you will have heard about the work that's been done in Wales, for example, over the last 18 months, where moxidectin resistance is really coming up on quite a large proportion of the farms that they're actually testing. So I'm not saying don't use it. If you do use it, be careful. Be careful to leave as many ewes untreated as you think you safely can. If you've used moxidectin this last winter as a scab treatment, I would really urge you to stay away from it as far as the spring treatment for ewes is concerned, because you've already put a lot of selection pressure on. And I would certainly be saying to you, the long-acting product, if you're looking at having to use something for sheep scab, that is absolutely one of the best tricks in the box, so to speak, for sheep scab. But you shouldn't be using it as a worming product as well if you want to preserve its activity into the future. Okay, so Katie, any questions on ewes?
Someone has asked, they believe there's a problem if they've had ewes vaccinated with footbacks with one of the wormers. Which one is it they shouldn't be using? That
is the moxidectin 1% injection. So if you've got ewes that have had footbacks, or any animal, ewes, rams that have had footbacks, or you think they might have had footbacks, then the 1% injection is the one that you're advised not to use. It's contraindicated.
Right, okay.
Okay. So if there's any more questions on that to come in, but the treatment of ewes is an area, which is had quite a lot. I think a lot of people now, whenever we do survey work, I think a lot of people have moved away from blanket treatment ewes pre-tupping. There's certainly a lot less of that goes on now. People are just treating the thinner, younger, poorer ewes. And basically what we're saying now is that actually we need to be moving our treatment of ewes around lambing more in that direction. So we're treating only those that need it and not those that don't. So if we just move on a little bit now, then one of the things that I know we covered when I did this last time was to just think about what a fecal egg count is. Because we all glibly talk about it, don't we? Fecal egg count, worm egg count, whatever it is. I think it's helpful to understand what that is in reality. So if anyone's actually looking at the manual, if you just look at page 4, in there is a life cycle, which is basically for most of the worms, apart from Nematodiris. Nematodiris does differ from that because of the annual cycle, as we were talking about earlier on. So a fecal egg count then, what are we actually doing with that? We're actually looking at it as a monitoring tool, and what it's telling us is something very important about how many adult worms there are inside our sheep producing eggs at the time that we take the sample. Now, what it's not actually telling us is how many infected larvae that sheep ate today. It's telling us how many infected larvae that sheep ate 2 to 3 weeks ago. So you've always got to be mindful of the fact that it's a monitoring tool, and it's not actually the way that we would want to use it in this sense, a diagnostic tool. Quite a lot of people, when they first start doing fecal egg counts, think, and I can understand why people would think that they go out and they'll just go and sample the skittery lambs, the scoury lambs in the field, or they perhaps only go and sample the ones that have got very hard pellets. And the problem is that is really just trying to use it as a diagnostic, and it actually can give you a very false result. So if we're going to use this as a monitoring tool to tell us about what's going on in those animals and how much contamination is going down on the pasture, we need to be careful that we take the samples properly, and I'll run through that in a minute, and we do use it just as a monitoring tool. So you can use fecal egg counts to help you to determine when to treat lambs, but if you only do them very, very randomly, now and again, it's quite difficult for your vet, for myself or other advisors to actually interpret that for you. Because what we really want to know is how much contamination was going down three weeks ago, and then when you do another fecal egg count, we can interpret that against what we knew was actually coming out the back of animals 3 weeks ago. And that makes a world of difference if you're using it as a regular monitoring tool. So we're looking at the dung. We take the dung and we're working out how many eggs per gram of dung there are, and from that we can actually relate that back to and interpret it as to how many worms, adult worms, are actually in that animal. And from what I've just said, I'm hoping you're realising now that it really, really does matter how you take these samples. Because if you go out and you just take the scouring lambs, unfortunately, if those lambs are scouring because they've just gone to a fresh bit of pasture, what you will get is a falsely low reading on your EPG. Because, of course, everything's going through them so quickly, the eggs are actually diluted. By the same token, if you go and all you do is take the lambs that are very, very hard pellets, and they're very, very hard pellets maybe because they're a bit complicated, that can give you a falsely high result. So it's really important that when you go in and you do a fecal egg count, you go into a group and you take at least 10, preferably nearer 20, samples at random, fresh ones at random, from individuals. Now you don't have to go around and catch them all. Just put them in a corner, wait until they've been in there a few minutes, and then move in with a pair of gloves on. I just use the warm test. If it's warm, it's fresh. If it ain't warm, it's not fresh. And so you just make sure it's fresh and take that. And then make sure that you take the same amount from each animal. So you don't want a tablespoonful from one animal and a teaspoonful from another, because the one that you've got the tablespoonful from is going to be skewing the results somewhat. Now, if your vet says to you, bring them all in separately, that's fine. You don't need to worry about the size of the samples, because they will then be sub-sampled in the lab. But if you're going to take a mob sample in, it's really important that each of the animals represents the same weight of or size of sample in that mob test, and then you get a pretty good indication of what's going on in that group of animals. Why does it need to be fresh? It needs to be fresh because obviously those eggs will start to hatch after they've been out in the dung for a few days. It's temperature dependent, but it does need to be fresh. You don't want them to start hatching, and then we're not going to get more. We're just going to get worm larvae. So doing effect then, make sure if you're going to do it that you do it absolutely right, because there's nothing worse than doing it wrong and then getting a result which isn't right, acting on that and then losing your confidence because it wasn't the right sample in the first place. Now this year I've got to finish it off yet and get it on the website, but by the time you guys all get going with doing effects this time, you should be able to go on the SCOPS website and download a single piece of A4 which will give you all of that basic information, step by step, how to do a fecal egg count properly. Is there any questions coming on that, Katie?
It's not necessarily linked with that. It's more of a general question, but I can bring it in now. There's somebody which their ewes have had footbacks, and he used Dectomax at lambing, not in the spring, but at lambing. He usually has a coxy and a nematodirus challenge. Can he use a white drench at the same time at 5 weeks as long with those others, or would it need to be like a week later or a couple of weeks later?
Well, I mean, you can certainly treat for coccidiosis at the same time as using a white drench. That's fine. Yeah. So there's no reason why you shouldn't give a white drench and one of the coccidial drenches at the same time. What you must not do is mix the two together in a pot and then give them in one drench. So you've got to give one and then you've either got two buns over, one over each shoulder, or you go down the race and you've got to go back and do them again. Yeah. You must not, you never, ever, ever mix anything with an anthelmintic, but certainly don't try mixing those two together. There's no reason why they shouldn't do that.
And do you think it'd be too much if they had their heptobac or overbac, whichever drench they're using at the same time as well?
No, that should be okay. I mean, the only thing I would say is that depends on the animals, really. I mean, obviously, if you're going to do something like, I presume, whether it's Heptavac or Ovivac or whatever, if you're going to use a vaccine like that on lambs, then if the lambs are suffering from, say, nematodirus coccidiosis, and there's some not doing so well, they're not going to respond to the vaccine that well either. To mount that immune response, they need to be healthy animals. So, if in doubt, you probably would be better to try not to. But then, if they're okay and you're handling them, the argument would be, well, why stress them twice? So there's nothing in those products which say thou shalt not give them their Heptavac or Ovivac at the same time. I would just say, look, if you're treating them and as a group you are treating animals which are not 100%, then you should perhaps just stop and think about what sort of response you're going to get to your vaccine.
Yeah, okay, that's great. That's all I've got in at the moment.
Okay, all right then. Trying to get fecal egg counts done is getting a lot easier now. I mean, obviously you can do them yourself. You can go out and get the commercial spec pack, Generation 1, or I've got Generation 2, or you can just, if you wish, go out and get yourself a reasonable microscope on eBay for not a lot of money and a McMaster slide, and you can download instructions as to how to use that if you wish, and some people have done that. You just need to make sure, I think, that if you do that, you do actually split some samples and send them off to a lab, off to your vet or wherever, just to quality control yourself to make sure that you have taught yourself to do it properly. Other than that, a lot of veterinary surgeries now are getting much, much easier. Many more veterinary surgeries are offering fecal egg counts. A lot more merchants are offering fecal egg counts as well. Some of them, as you know, it's a standard service and not very expensive. And there are other commercial labs. So it really is getting to be much, much easier. And I think, down to as low as £5 for a mob sample. It's not an expensive thing for people to do. But do remember to do the samples properly in the first place. Okay, so just moving on then, when are you going to start doing fecal egg counts? I've just said to you earlier on that from the point of view of nematodirus, really fecal egg counting isn't very useful. Although once treated, again, I would say it is worth just checking that you haven't nematodirus in there that have continued to go on and start egg laying by testing about 8 or 9 days after the treatment. Normally we would say depends on when the lambs were born, but most people, if your lambs are getting towards that sort of 6 or 8 weeks of age, you probably want to start monitoring towards the end of April, early May. As a general guide, depends whereabouts you are in the country. But, they do need to be old enough to have been eating grass. Most lambs will start eating grass at 3 to 4 weeks of age, so they are going to be picking up larvae at that stage. And then, as we've said, with the life cycle, it's another 2 to 3 weeks. So just work that through, and you are looking at lambs being 6 to 8 weeks of age probably before you want to start doing your monitoring. So one of the most important things I would suggest that you do, even if you don't get into doing very regular monitoring with sex, and I think as I've just said, I probably have just rattled a bit of a warning sign there that, going in and just doing the odd fecal egg count and relying on that to determine when you need to drench your lambs in mid-season against the main worm groups other than the nematodirus, you need to be careful. If you're going to do that, you need to make sure you do some regular monitoring and you know where you're going with it. But one thing that you could do, if you don't want to go that far at this stage, and you do want to start just having a look, the really useful thing is to use your first fecal egg counts to determine whether or not the drench that you're using is working as effectively as it should be. One of the misconceptions, I think, with resistance is that it happens suddenly, that you'll be going along and everything's fine and your worm control's working really, really well, and all of a sudden, one year you go in and you use a drench and it's not working. That hasn't happened. What has happened is that over the last 5, 10, 15 years, depending on how selective practices you've been putting in place, your worm has been getting gradually less and less effective as the number of resistant worms has increased. So it ain't going to happen overnight. But en route to that, what's happening is, of course, that you're losing out in terms of lamb performance. Because if you're not killing all the worms in them, when you do go in and treat them, the worms that are staying alive in them are going to actually reduce their performance. So what we want to do is to identify when a worm is on the slippery slope before you really fall off the edge of the cliff, from where there is no going back. So once you've gone over the cliff with a worm group and it isn't working anymore, you are not going backwards. You can't climb back up the cliff. But if we identify it early, then we can stop you getting to the cliff's edge for quite a few years, depending on how far you are and which worm it is. So very, very important to give yourself an early warning. And that is really relatively easy to do. All you have to do is get yourself a couple of worm sample kits, either from your lab, vet, merchant, wherever. When you first go in to do your first main drench of the season, not the Nematodirus one this time, but your main drench of the season, don't worry about whether or not taking effect, but just take the effect as you drench them, so you know how many adult worms there were in those sheep, that group of sheep, when you drenched them that day. And then on the diary, black out either a day 7 days later or 14 days later. 7 days later if it's a yellow drench that you've used, 14 days later if it's one of the others, and then use the second spec, go back into that group, take another set of samples and find out whether or not your drenching's been fully effective. And that's the first indication for you as to whether all in the garden is actually as you think it is. The difference it makes if you find that it wasn't fully effective and you go back in and use something which was, is amazing. And I don't think I can labour that point enough, because if we look at the wormer market in the UK, then it's clear that there's still a really significant proportion of white drench being used out there, far greater than people can be using just for Nematodirus. Yet we also know that on nearly 100% of farms, certainly in England and Wales, we can detect resistance to the white drenches. So there's a lot of people out there using a white drench in the mistaken belief that it's still working for them. You might be lucky and it might be working for you, but for most people it isn't doing the job that they think it is against the major worm species other than the Nematodirus, and you're losing out on performance. So, it's a nice way to ease your way into just doing a couple of lots of fecal egg counts as well, without sort of pushing the boat out too much. But the information that you get back from that little toe in the water is likely to give things quite a big boost if you do find out that what you're using isn't working as well as you'd hoped.
How often should people be changing their wormer groups then, Lesley? Someone's asked the question how frequently they should change their different wormer groups, both for ewes and for lambs.
Yeah, okay, good question, very good question, and it's really nice to hear that one, because obviously for years we've been trying to, originally we used to say people should rotate their wormer groups annually, so they weren't using the same wormer group year on year. Now we have moved on from that, but it is right to be thinking about changing the wormer groups, and to be honest, there's no hard and fast rule, because it really does depend on what groups are working for you, which ones aren't, whether or not you've got sheep scab and you're having to use some of the group 3s, particularly perhaps with the pressure on moxidectin as well for sheep scab control, and also, what time you're lambing, what your pastures are like. So the main thing for people to think about is really to get yourself armed with, and I know BRP, you've got a cattle and sheep wormer booklet, Katie. I'm just updating our 2016 one now for sheep, is get yourself armed with what the groups are out there, what they're best for, and be prepared to change within a season. So we're talking tonight about nematodirus, and we're saying that for most people, a white drench is still going to be right for nematodirus. But don't go out and buy 10 litres of white drench and think, right, well, I'll just carry on using white drench for the rest of the season. That's not what you want to do. You want to be thinking about what's best for the lambs later on. If a white drench isn't working properly for me, why would I do that? I need to be changing things as the season goes on. So the other thing that people need to think very hard about is that, of course, we've got two new groups. They're not new anymore, actually. The orange group, which has been out and available for just I think 4 years now. 6 years. 2012. I'm starting to look. Anyway, several years. And we've also got the group 3, which has been out for several years now as well. Sorry, group 5, purple. I'm getting confused now. Group 4 and group 5 that we've had with us for some time, and we're just not using them. And so the advice is to you to have a think about and go and talk to your vet, because there's a prescription-only groups, and to think about using one or other of those later in the season. So it does get a bit complicated, guys. I know it does, because it used to be easy. You could say, right, okay, this season I'm going to use, let's say, group 2, and you go out and you could buy all the group 2 you thought you wanted for the season, and then you could use it. And now we're saying, do you know what, you might use one thing on your ewes, and then some white on your lambs, and then something else on your lambs, and then we want you to use a group 4 or 5. But that's the way it is if we want to get the best performance and we want to actually protect our worms for the future.
And can people protect their sheep by grazing with either horses or cattle as a protector? If you do graze and you mixed graze, then obviously the worms aren't going to cross over. So you will actually, the other species will help to kill worms off effectively. So you will reduce the challenge. The problem is that you're unlikely to have such good grazing management if you try and mix grazing cattle and sheep together. The sward heights you want are different, the requirements are different, and so the actual nutritional value of what you're putting in front of the animals isn't so great. So it can almost be a betwixt and between. What you're probably better off doing is maybe swapping cattle and sheep grazing, so that, you know, if you can, the old sheep one year, cattle the other, but even if you go cattle then sheep or sheep then cattle in the same season, at least you are reducing the amount of challenge that's there. So it's thinking about it really and what's the best option all round. Okay, that's great. There's no other questions at the moment, Lesley. I don't think if anyone else has got any other questions, if you can send them in quickly, because I think we've got, that's everything you were going to go through, wasn't it, Lesley?
I think so.
Or is there anything else?
I think so. Yeah, definitely. Yeah.
Well, if anyone has got any other questions that springs to mind after the conference call, obviously you can still email them in, and I'm sure between myself and Lesley we'll try and get those answered. If you'd like to receive the expert view sheet with notes about what we've been talking about tonight, then again email in to brpconf at ahdb.org.uk, and we'll email you the expert view sheet across. And again, if you needed the manual, then again we can email you a copy of that. So I think all there is to say is thank you very much, Lesley. Hopefully everybody knows the website address, the SCOPS website address. If you pop into Google nematodirus map SCOPS, it definitely comes up as one of the first things. I think 2015 comes up as the first one, but the second one down brings up the map for you to check and monitor daily or weekly, you know, how often you want to monitor the risk for your area.
Yeah. And so that, and as I say, as we were saying, it's updated daily. So just have it on your favourites and just keep clicking and have a look and watch the dots change colour, basically. Okay. Well, thank you very much, Lesley. Thank you for your time, and thank you for everybody else taking their time, whether it's out the lambing shed or if you finish lambing, just taking time out of your evening to update yourself on the latest worm control information. Thank you very much. Okay, thanks. Bye-bye.